Yes, so this is a new talk. It might be a bit rough. I'm going to quickly basically talk a bit about my background in the industry, how I got in and stuff. A quick update of the history of game cameras since the beginning of the industry. A bit about cinematic grammar as used in games. Some of the issues with interactive applications that we have with cameras. And then moving on to what is coming up, the sort of issues that you guys are going to have to deal with if you go into the industry. So I graduated in 1996 and have worked at a variety of companies, worked short stints at Pepper's Ghost, Electronic Arts, Intelligent Games before I settled at Traveller's Tales about 14 years ago. And I've done pretty much a bit of everything at Traveller's Tales, but for the last 3 years or so, I've specialised in virtual cameras and rewritten all their camera systems, which I was particularly excited about because I'm also interested in film. I make music videos and shorts and stuff, and I'm also the co-founder of Games Wales North, which basically runs social events and talks like this for students in that neck of the woods, which is how I got into speaking at places like this. So that's Lego Dimensions. Most recently I've been working on some Doctor Who related mechanics for that. I'll be talking a bit about Lego Worlds as well, which is out on Steam in early access at the moment. So games, the very first games just used the screen, the full screen that was like the most obvious amount of play field. And because the hardware wasn't very powerful, it was just redrawing everything on the screen. It was quite an expensive process. So what we've got here is Asteroids, Gunfight, and Manic Miner. Does anybody here know what the bitwise operation exclusive OR is? A handful of people. It's an incredibly useful thing because it was so expensive to redraw the entire screen. Stuff like Manic Miner, the conveyor belt on Manic Miner would have been done as palette shifted animation. So what was written to the screen was the same, and they would just change a little palette, which caused the conveyor belt to look like it was scrolling, and the sprites that actually move around on screen were placed using this bitwise operation, which the maths, some of you know the maths, it doesn't really matter, but basically what it means is if you print pixels over other pixels, then if it's on black, it comes out as the same colour. On other colours, it gets a bit mucky. But if you then print the same picture on again, it goes back to what it was before, which means that they can move the characters around by drawing them onto the screen, and then on the next frame, drawing them back onto the screen where they were, and then moving them onto the next frame. So a game like Manic Miner would only have to redraw the things that moved on screen. Of course, because of the exclusive OR, that meant that the colours all went crazy when they overlapped with things, but it was just something that we lived with. Pretty quickly, people started wanting to make bigger games than you could fit on one screen, so they started making flip screen games like Adventure, Dizzy, that's Jet Set Willy 2 up there, which allow them to create much larger environments, places to explore, secrets and Easter eggs and things like that. Jet Set Willy 2, you could take a rocket up to a space station, and there's a yacht you could take to an island on one corner, and somewhere down there there's you could fall down a hole that led to hell. Just fun stuff that wasn't really part of the game, it was just little secrets to discover. And that's King's Quest V on the end there. That trend of using sort of flip screen mechanics is still being used today with point and click adventures like Broken Age. Although they sort of pan left and right a bit, and they are redrawing the screen all the time, they take advantage of a static piece of artwork as the backdrop, which allows them to present something just the way that they want it. But at the same time, other people were doing more dynamic camera movement. So Defender allowed you to scroll across the landscape so that you felt like you were actually moving somewhere. The ship would stay still and the landscape would move underneath you. Obviously, Mario and Sonic made great use of scrolling to give you a large space to explore and feel like you could move around it freely. At the same time, other people wanted to explore fully like 3D environments. And before we could do proper 3D, isometric projections like this were quite common. That's Sandy White's 3D Ant Attack, Alienate by Ultimate, and Heimdall by can't remember. Might have been Gremlin. These tended to be puzzle games based around like stacking blocks up to get to places or pushing things off ledges into holes and stuff like that. The first Batman game looked a lot like Alienate there over the side. You were exploring the Batcave and it was full of Batman gadgets gone haywire and stuff. But inevitably, people wanted to do proper 3D, a genuine window into a world. So early experiments with that were things like Battlezone, Elite, Starglider, wireframe projections. The problem with wireframe is that it doesn't occlude anything. You can see through a ship in Elite. If you line up a ship and a space station in the original Elite, then you can see one through the other. That's why all of the original Elite spaceships were convex shapes, because they couldn't occlude themselves. Pretty soon, though, people started doing filled polygons, which was much more processing, but it allowed people to do environments with walls that you couldn't see through. So this is, again, Sandy White again, creator of 3D Ant Attack, but this is Eye of the Mask, which was a maze exploration game. I think it's the earliest example of a third-person 3D game that I can find, with you having that little sprite at the bottom. Then Driller is one of the early first-person 3D exploration games. That gave you a whole planet to explore, rendered in filled polygons like that, and puzzles to solve. Some people were trying to do 3D by faking it. So Dungeon Keeper, up there, you could only turn in increments of 90 degrees in order that your viewpoint lined up with the corridor, and they could use like pre-built wall tiles to create those environments, and different floor tiles for pits and solid floor and spike traps and stuff like that. But that allowed them to get much like better looking walls than the sort of filled polygons that they could do. As technology improved, we started to get properly textured 3D environments like Tomb Raider over on the end there. That was released in '96. And 18 years later, we've got stuff that looks like this, which is the new Tomb Raider. Well, the 2014 Tomb Raider. And the next thing is going to be virtual reality, which brings a whole new load of issues to do with latency and so on, because when you move your head, the image is projected on the screen. If you remain looking at something and move your head from side to side whilst focusing on the same object, then that object is actually going to slide across the screen, which means that the screen has to update as fast as your head is moving with no latency. Otherwise, it feels like you're seeing through weird jelly or something. So that's why virtual reality games have to have an incredibly high frame rate. They need to be at least 60, if not 90 frames per second to maintain that illusion. I'm going to talk more about virtual reality in a bit. That, by the way, is a little VR game called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, in which one player has a bomb to defuse and another, a helper who doesn't have the VR headset, has the instruction manual. So, cinematic grammar in games. Cinema was quite a mature medium by the time games started up. So, games borrowed quite heavily from what we saw as a kind of similar medium. And a lot of games wanted wanted to be films and like have the same engagement with the audience that films have. So again, because it was very difficult to render an entire world at runtime, games like Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil there would have pre-rendered backdrops that had been prepared offline, so that they would only have to render the characters over the top of it. That meant that they had to have static cameras, but it meant that they could get better performance from just rendering the characters. And for certain applications, it allowed them to go for quite dramatic camera angles. So you can use all the cinematic grammar of Dutch tilt and having a high camera angle to make someone look feeble and powerless, a low camera angle to make them look towering and strong, that sort of thing. But that tends to work better for survival horror games because it's quite unnerving to not to see the game from an unfamiliar angle and be able to control the characters in a slightly counterintuitive way. But that kind of disconnect works quite well for survival horror, not so well for other formats. Batman, Arkham City there is an interesting case. What you're looking at there is Dutch tilt, which is also referred to in Hollywood as a Batman angle due to its massive overuse in the 60s Batman TV show. And there's a nice chapter in Arkham City in which Batman is poisoned, and for the entire chapter, the camera, the chase camera that you have control of, slowly tilts further and further onto its side as you get towards the end of the chapter. Lens, because we wanted to mimic cinema, and cinemas are filmed with cameras, cinema is full of lens artifacts. Mostly these are things that photographers and cinematographers try to avoid, things like lens flare, unless you're J.J. Abrams. That is usually considered sort of like something that you want to prevent. But in games, we want to bring that in because it makes the game look real to have lens flare in there, and it got quite overused in the 90s, and people started to be a bit derogatory about lens flare. And then we moved on to bloom, as used really well in Prince of Persia. That creates the light spilling off bright glowing objects is due to in celluloid. It's because of the way that the light falling on the chemicals on the celluloid spread, the chemical reactions spread under the influence of light. So it's very much a celluloid artifact, but we fake it in games because it creates a kind of like soft, warm look, which was very appropriate for Prince of Persia. And of course, motion blur, which is a real help for fast-moving objects, because we see motion blur in cinemas all the time because cinema is 24 frames per second, and if the camera is moving at all or people are moving through the frame, with a 24th of a second exposure, you get quite a blurred image. So that does add realism, but if you overdo it, then it can make it feel a bit queasy. So there's a lot of other artifacts and like lens things that we tend to put in, things like a vignette where it goes dark at the edges of the screen, which is again another camera artifact, and focus artifacts, which I will move on to now. This sort of thing, these kind of shapes on the outer focus things in the background, that is the shape that the shutter makes as it irises open. So depending on what make of camera you use and how many blades are in the shutter, you get like pentagonal, hexagonal, septagonal, just different shapes of, they call it bokeh. But again, we've tried to fake that sort of thing in games. That's an Unreal test shot, but it was the best example of depth of field that I could find in a game. Focus is, again, something that in photography and cinematography, in principle, you want things to be sharp and in focus, but it's quite difficult to get things perfectly in focus because the only way to get focus to infinity is with a pinhole camera, and that lets very, very little light in. So you've got a balance between how much light you allow in and how sharp you can get the focal point. And if you have the shutter wide open, then you let a lot of light in, which is good, but you can't get very much of the subject in focus. High-end cameras can get a depth of field that is down to millimeters, so you can take a photograph of a penny piece and the middle of it can be in focus and the front and the back can be soft and blurry. But it's used to great effect in cinema to draw people's attention to things. You've seen focus pulls from something going on in the background to something in the foreground. It's a great way of drawing the audience's attention from one thing to another in frame, and that can be used in games as well to focus the player's attention on one particular thing. We sometimes do focus pulls that don't look as good as they do in cinema, but it's a good effort. It can work quite well in combat situations if you get into a button bash with an enemy and it pulls the focus tightly onto just the two of you fighting, and like everything else becomes kind of like, yeah, you don't care about that. You only care about this bit that I'm drawing your attention to. And editing. Editing is a difficult one for games because the camera usually has to follow the player or what the player is doing. So the most powerful tool in cinema's toolbox, which is juxtaposing different things in the edit, is not easily available to us. But some games do some clever stuff. GTA, for example, GTA 5 has a very nice, very macro level edit where you play some of the story as one of the three main characters, and then at a certain point it will zoom out, pan away across the city and zoom back into another character and pick up their story after some time has passed. And it uses that. That's a great technique for moving from one character to another. And the fact that the three different characters represent wildly different styles of playing the game is quite a clever one too. So like Trevor is a complete psycho, and that gives the player every time they introduce Trevor, he's done something mental, and you find him on a beach in his underwear surrounded by bodies, for example, and it just gives the player that license to go, oh, you can do crazy stuff with this character, it would be appropriate. But with games, we have problems with interactivity because we've got to follow what the player's doing. It's got to be functional. We've got to show the player everything that they need to see, or depending, sometimes not what they need to see, but what they want to see. And sometimes we need to tell them that what they are currently looking at is not what they should be looking at. So Mario 64 was one of the first games that really did a free-roaming camera quite well. And I'm going to be talking about the chase camera that I refined a bit for LEGO Worlds. The interesting thing about LEGO Worlds is that because it's a fully editable environment, similar to Minecraft, but it's not at all a Minecraft clone. We can't make any assumptions about what the camera can do and where it can go. The players could build any shape, and the camera just has to cope with it. So we can't. In our normal games, what we would do is place camera volumes to say, well, when the player's in this area, most of the story levels in LEGO games, we put camera volumes that say, well, if the player's here, then the camera will be over here looking at them from that angle, and then if they go into that little tight area, then the camera will move around to get a better view, and then it'll come back when they come out. And we can control that, and even in a wide open hub, like in LEGO Marvel or LEGO Lord of the Rings, if there's tight spaces, then we can put a camera volume in there and we take control away from the player and the camera doesn't move anymore and it just stays in a place where it's got a reasonable view. But we can't do that for LEGO Worlds, so we had to make the chase camera as effective as possible. So the number one issue there is getting it to collide with the landscape and testing whether there is something in between the camera and the player. So these screenshots are from a dev diary that I did on Steam, which you should be able to find if you search dev diary camera on the LEGO Worlds forum. The lower shot is what the camera is interested in from the upper shot. So it only looks a certain distance. It's only concerned about the space between the player and the camera, and just like enough of around that space to detect anything that's about to come in between the player and the camera. And it doesn't care about what colour the bricks are. It only cares about whether they're solid or not. So they're represented as basically vertical stretches of a solid cell, which is what all of those vertical lines represent. But the rules are basically that if the camera sort of slices through all of those lines horizontally and vertically, and then projects all of that flat onto the screen and says, right, okay, is anything coming in between the player and the camera from the top or the bottom or the left or the right, and it will move the camera away from it when it gets close enough. And that solves most of the problems. It means that the camera will move away. But the player has control of the camera. So what happens if the camera moves away from the tree and the player goes, now I want to move it back? We have to prioritise what the player wants to do, but we don't necessarily want the player to clip the camera into a tree or anything. So when the player has manually moved the camera somewhere, we have to take a different tack. We assume that the player knows where they want the camera to point, so we just have to try to cope with that. And if the player points the camera up to look at Ryu and Ken, then the camera has to avoid clipping through the ground, the camera has to zoom in close. Similarly, if the player goes inside an igloo, then the camera's got to get right in there with them, and in some cases that means getting almost zoomed into very close to first person, which is tricky. 5 minutes. Right. Directing attention. Some games like Gears of War will give you a Y prompt to say, we want to take control and show you something, whereas other games like Journey will just pull the camera back and leave you running around in the foreground while they show you something. So you haven't lost control, but the camera has moved. So where things are moving on from there is virtual reality. Once you've got the virtual reality headset on, you have no frame. You can look all the way around. So you have to build you can't build just one side of a level. You've got no lens. That also includes no HUD. You can't have a 2D HUD floating in front of your face. You need some sort of 3D HUD. Turns out it's quite natural to have HUD elements floating around your head at about arm's reach in virtual reality. You don't have any way of focusing the player's attention with cutscenes or like Y prompts like Gears of War does. So we need to take tips from theatre where they use like Spotlight to pick out a particular actor who you should be paying attention to. We can't edit. Can barely even move in virtual reality. Any movement that isn't driven by the player themselves is very unsettling. Roller coasters, instant motion sickness. So again, we need to take a tip from theatre where the audience are seated and everything happens in front of them, and we can change stuff around and do set changes and potentially some metaphorical set changes rather than, although the nice thing about virtual reality is that the theatre is constrained by the physics of what they can actually get into the theatre and what they can move during the performance. In virtual reality, we can do anything like that. So you could put on a play in virtual reality and change everything around the audience. That's not a problem. But all of these things are basically the experimental. We don't know what the new virtual reality media is going to look like. It's unlikely that anybody is going to want to put a virtual reality headset in and play Gears of War for 8 hours straight, like you might at the weekend on an Xbox. So probably short films and short games experiences. But we just don't know. People are trying things, but until it's out to market, we don't know. What Hollywood are trying to do is spherical video, where they use a rig like that, video an entire environment, and then stretch it into a square pixel form like that, so that they can work on it and they can paint out all the crew, because there's no off camera for the crew to hide. So they have to do a lot of touching up to make it work, and they've had to adapt their tools to cope with, like, there's a lot of stretch at the bottom of the frame there, and any painting tools need to accommodate for that. But that solution is something that John Carmack has described as a god-awful hack, because that camera rig does not register any separate stereoscopic image. It can't cope with head movement. If you move left and right, it won't notice. You're literally just watching, and it's completely non-interactive. So for the first time, Hollywood are going to have to come to the games industry and learn about some of our tricks for directing the player's focus to the things that they're supposed to be looking at. And they have found already that they make VR spherical movies, and they put a sound behind the audience and expect them to turn around, and they don't, because they're used to watching a movie, and anything that's important will come in front and be shown to them. The audience need to learn how to watch a virtual reality movie, and that is what some of you guys could be doing when you graduate. Does anybody have any questions? Yep. Yes? Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I wrote that, and that was my solution to. I knew that the camera would never be able to cope with every possible circumstance, so I basically wrote a system that would basically, if the camera did clip inside something, it would basically nibble away all the Lego blocks to remove the obstruction. And it's got its limitations. It can only go so far, and it costs quite a lot to re-render the scene that way. But it pops. It deliberately pops because, like, any sort of transition would just be unmanageable with so many individual Lego bricks. So, and it reminds me of the little stop-motion Lego adverts that were on telly in the 80s when I grew up.
Excellent stuff. Can I have a round of applause, please?
Thank you.